with a little video.
Our guide said that this place of Tanganyika is built to teach you that this is hiding place for which we have searched so long. It's hard to believe. I'm afraid it's only a feverish mirage that vanished before my eyes. After all these months of disappointments, can I dare believe that I have won? The next few moments will give me the answer. Dr. Livingston, I presume. Yes. Thank God, Doctor, I've been permitted to see you. I'm thankful that I'm here to welcome you, Mr. Stanley. Mr. Stanley. Lord, well, Mr. Stanley, come in. I've had fever. I've been traveling day and night since I found out you were here. It's been over a year since we left Savings. Sit down. Then it isn't merely luck that you came. No. No, I came to find you, Doctor. Find me.
All right, here we go. Continue with the note. So we mentioned that, obviously you've got, the British that are interested, and they're sending missionaries and explorers into the region, just kind of looking at different things. But the first country that really dives in to Africa and really wants to grab tremendous amounts of land is going to be Belgium. Okay. Now, remember, we talked yesterday about how the majority of these European nations they're all just kind of congregating around the coast, right? Nobody really wants to go into the interior because of, like I said, people go in, they don't come out. And Belgium is really just going to go all in. They're going to just accept the risk. They are going to push to the interior part of Africa. All of this is going to be under the leadership of King Leopold II. Now, the problem with Leopold II is he's a pretty brutal leader. And a lot of this goes back to what we talked about, this concept of imperialism, of political, social, economic, military dominance, right, of one nation over another. Well, in his mind, the only way that a European nation, really any nation, could successfully navigate and maneuver through Africa is to basically use its power and might. Okay? And it's exactly what he's going to do. I'm just going to skip this quote. You don't have to know it. So the area that he's going to go to, or really want the Belgian government to look at, is the Congo. the first person that he kind of talks to about this, of leading this type of an expedition, was actually Henry Stanley. Why would Henry Stanley? I mean, you remember, he was born in England. He's been in the United States working for the New York Herald. Why Henry Stanley? Yeah.
Because he's the only one who really knows about it.
Yeah, he's been there. He knows what the terrain is like. He knows that, in terms of interacting with different tribes. In the mind of Leopold, Stanley is the perfect person to actually go and do this for Belgium, and he pays him a lot. Okay, pays him a substantial amount of money to actually go back to the region. Well, while he is there, they discover a certain type of tree in the Congo. And what would happen, and I'll show you a picture in just a second, they could cut these trees, not necessarily cut them down, but they would cut into them. And they would kind of put these little spigots in them. And then what would happen is some of the moisture would come out of the tree and they would gather into these bowls. And in the climate, it would start to dry up and it becomes almost a rubberized material. Okay, and they call them rubber trees. Okay, so the rubber trees become, because think about it, where in the world are you getting rubber? Yeah, but where are you getting that? There's not a whole lot of oil in Europe. So it gives them an opportunity to make more money, right? And so, with this being said, Leopold sees like just dollar signs everywhere. This is an opportunity for the Belgian government to become substantially wealthy, okay? And Stanley, being paid very heavily by the Belgian government, is going to do the task of Leopold. And they're going to trick some of these leaders in Africa or in the Congo into signing treaties that basically would give up their land to the Belgians. So this is what these trees would look like. So they kind of cut them and they put these spigots in and fill up these bowls, and it would kind of solidify and become a rubberized material. Well, who do you think is going to be harvesting these trees? Africans. So, Leopold orders the Belgian authorities in the Congo to actually capture Africans and put them into slave labor. And if they refused, they were punished. And they were punished drastically. Okay? You can say over 10 million Congolese are actually going to die at the hands of the Belgian leadership in the Congo. And it would start by, okay, if you didn't meet your quota, I'm going to skip through this. This is what we're talking about, the area of Africa. this is what would happen. You didn't meet your quota, let's chop your hand off. You didn't meet your quota again, they killed you. Because you were no use without two hands, right? Well, how productive are you with one hand in harvesting trees? Not very. Okay, so this becomes kind of an ongoing thing. And it gets so bad that other European nations start to look at it and go, wait a minute now, this is a little over the edge. We actually have this that's published in a London newspaper called In the Rubber Coils. And it's, you've got the head of Leopold, obviously, of, wrapping himself as a snake around an African captive. But one thing, and you don't really want to say the good out of all this, but there is something that he did with the money. He wanted Belgium to kind of go through a transformation. And if you remember, we talked about this with Louis XIV. Remember Louis XIV, what he did with a lot of the money that was accumulated under his reign? Do you remember? Yeah. Okay. Arts, developing the country. One way that he put it into, remember that was around the time that architecture was also considered art, and there was a lot of buildings, including, there was kind of a big place that he lived. Versailles. Okay. So one of the things that Leopold is going to do is he's going to take a lot of that money and put it into the architecture, and he's remembered, obviously for the bad things that he did, but he's also known as the Builder King in Belgium. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of the architecture that is, comes about as a result of the rubber trade. So all of this is built by Leopold because of the money that they get from Africa. This is actually a quote in Antwerp. You can see this is the English translation. I've undertaken the work in the Congo in the interest of civilization and for the good of Belgium. Remember that phrase, in the interest of civilization, because we're going to talk about that in a greater meaning here in just a little bit. So what ends up taking place is, I told you that some of these European nations start to kind of see what's going on with how Leopold is treating people in Africa. And European nations start to take notice of this. Now, I want you to picture in your mind the size of Belgium. Okay, we've done maps, right? So you should have an idea in your mind the size of Belgium. Is it large or small? Relatively small. Okay, so you've got nations like England, France, Spain, Germany. They actually go and look at what's going on in Belgium, or what's going on in the Congo, and they begin putting pressure on the Belgian government. Okay, that's actually my phone. Putting pressure on the Belgian government, and essentially saying, if you don't do something about Leopold, remove him from power, then we are going to invade Belgium. Well, Belgium is not in a place where they could sustain that type of a war with other European nations. So what the Belgian government decides to do is basically remove Leopold from power. Now, this is important. When you look at the size of Belgium and you compare it to the colony that's been created in Africa, the colony in Africa is 80 times larger. So for a small nation, that's a lot to deal with. Would you agree? Okay. Now, there's another part of this puzzle that's very important for the discussion of imperialism. If imperialism is the political, social, economic, and military dominance of a stronger nation over another nation, a weaker nation, and these other European nations have just gone to the Belgian government and told them, if you don't get rid of Leopold, we are going to war with you. And what did the Belgian government do? Didn't they give in to the European nations? So if they can give in to the European nations, what about the mindset of those stronger European powers?
They can take over.
We can keep going. Okay? And that's exactly what happens. That opens the door for what we call historically the scramble for Africa. Okay? You've got Spain, Italy, Portugal, France, Germany, obviously the Belgians, the Dutch, the British. Everybody that is a power in Europe is now going to Africa. So, by the time we get to this point, I've given you the definition of imperialism, right? Well, there's some factors that are starting to really push the idea of imperialism. One, and I don't have it written up here, but it needs to go with the first bullet point, okay? Because it's a word that's going to be very important for us down the road when we start talking about basically Europe being on the verge of a total war, okay? What am I talking about? The Great War, World War I, okay? It's called nationalism. Nationalism. So, nationalism is defined as extreme pride in your nation. Okay? Well, the mindset that begins to take place in Europe at this time is that if that European nation can go somewhere else in the world and basically take it over, okay, right? That's that superiority factor. Take that land, then it made them prouder. It kind of bred this idea of extreme pride in their nation, which is nationalism. And that nationalistic idea is going to take hold everywhere in Europe. Everybody in Europe's kind of beating their chest and, okay, I'm the strongest. And at some point, all that stuff's going to come together and everybody's going to start clashing, which is going to lead to the Great War. Okay. You have a sense of racial superiority. Europeans believed they were better than cultures that were not white, whether it be India, Africa, Asia. Doesn't matter. And so there is a racial superiority in the minds of a lot of Europeans. Throw in the idea of what we mentioned with social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest. If my nation can conquer yours, is that my fault? That's how it is. Survival of the fittest. There's also another concept. You don't have to necessarily write this down, but kind of store it in the back of your mind, because whether you want to believe this or not, it's true, and you'll kind of learn this as you continue through school and get into college. But historically, there's a concept called might makes right. Might makes right. What does that mean?
The more powerful you are, it doesn't really matter if you're wrong or right. So like, if you have power, you're right.
Okay. Okay, good. Both of those are correct. And here's a good way to look at it. So, by this point, I mean, you're in ninth grade. You haven't gone through all these history classes yet, but you've gone through some. Do y'all even take Alabama history? Do y'all take that anymore? That's a shame. That's an absolute shame that y'all take Alabama history. But anyway, how many history books do you think, or let's say, if you open up a history book, have y'all taken any kind of American history course yet?
Yeah, it's just
Okay, maybe even in sixth grade, but you've had some type of exposure to American history. Am I correct in saying that? All right, so when you opened up your history book and you read about, I don't know, maybe things that happened with Native Americans here in the United States, is the story told from the Native Americans' perspective? No. Why?
because they lost.
Might makes right. When you get into World War II, or World War I for that matter, it doesn't matter, whichever war, how many times do you see it written from the German perspective?
0.
None. The Civil War. We have a little bit more of an understanding because you live in the South, and so there's more publications about what took place in terms of the Civil War here. But if you go up north, and I actually experienced this firsthand, was just talking to people that had grew up north and had never really been exposed to Southern culture. There's no perspective of the South. Might makes right. You win, you get to write the story. Right or wrong, you get to write the story. So for these European nations, who they know they can defeat smaller nations, they don't care, because at the end of the day, they get to write the story. It's their perspective. And so in their mind, they don't see it as it's a problem. If I can conquer you, that's your problem, not mine. You should have been stronger. Survival of the fittest. These two concepts also play into this. That's why I told you to kind of remember that idea of what Leopold said about the Congo and civilizing, right? Civilizing the rest of the world. All right, so civilizing the Congo. Europeans believed that it was their job to make everybody in the world just like them. Everybody needed to be westernized. Everybody needed to have this idea of what it means to be an industrial society and capitalistic. Okay. And obviously with like religious values, things of that nature. It was their job to bring progress to the rest of the world. And that's kind of their mentality. Now, is that wrong or right? Depends on the perspective, right? Do we do this? Yes. You bet. Absolutely. Now, you can argue that it's wrong, but you know, what country that really believes in itself, and that's why I wanted you to understand that idea of nationalism, what country that really has true pride in itself and believes in who they are, who doesn't want other people to experience that? Because, I mean, let's face it, if you don't like how things are done here, do you have an opportunity to leave? Yeah. But most people don't, right? And so now it becomes this kind of weird dynamic of, you know, we don't really like the notion of might makes right, but deep down we all live the notion of might makes right. Does that make sense? And it all kind of comes from this idea of imperialism, and that's exactly what's taking place here. So what makes it possible? Well, for some of these tribes in Africa that throw spears, it's not really a match for the Maxim gun that was developed in Europe that could fire up to 500 rounds a minute. It's just not. So that kind of takes some things off the table. Well, as more and more European nations arrive in Africa, they, instead of traveling through the wilderness or whatever, in Africa, they begin to lay rail lines to make that transportation a lot smoother. They even changed their boats. Where we talked about the rapids and the shallow waters of some of the rivers, they start to change how their steamboats were built to be able to navigate those parts of Africa. So there's a lot of different things that are taking place in an attempt to change how this idea of imperialism could happen. Because, guys, to be perfectly honest, and go back to that cartoon that I showed you of all those European nations kind of pulling on Africa. Remember that? That was on the slide before. It's a race. These European nations are on a race to capture Africa and get as much out of Africa as they can. And so everybody's getting involved. People are all in. Another thing that comes about during this time is something called quinine. Quinine was an elixir that was used to treat malaria. Remember we talked about malaria being one of the issues, right, with mosquitoes in Africa. Well, now quinine is introduced, and it helps stop the spread of malaria and treat malaria. So, what does that do? It allows more people to come in without the fear of getting sick. So all of these factors start to become very dominant in what's happening in Africa. So one thing that they become very smart about, remember I told you yesterday, how many languages are spoken in Africa? Over 1,000. We said it's very segmented, right? It's very divided. There's no unity. Well, some of these European nations start to realize this, and they start pitting these tribes against each other. Well, when that starts to happen, the Europeans begin to exploit it and begin trading with all these tribes to get more what? Money and more resources. And so it becomes, I'm smarter than you. So not only am I more powerful, now I'm smarter. Because remember, it's a cultural superiority thing. And it worked. Next thing we know, Europe is dominating Africa. I mean, it goes back to that picture that I showed you at the height of imperialism in 1914, all those different colors that existed in Africa. Europe has essentially taken over Africa at this point. And there's, all kinds of different ideas. Like for instance, this was published in a Boston newspaper about how, they didn't, we didn't like it, but we're about to start doing the same thing just somewhere else in the world. So the more that these European nations really start to dive into Africa and really want to have some stronghold, there becomes an underlying problem. At some point, when these European nations that are on the coast, right, they start pushing further and further inland, what's going to happen? They're going to clash. There's going to be fighting. There's going to be aggression. And so they're trying to fix this problem ahead of time. So they agree, these European powers agreed to meet in Berlin in 1884 at what we know as the Berlin Conference. And the purpose of this conference is to lay out the rules of how Africa is going to be divided among these European superpowers. Okay? And they essentially would have to prove, if that part of Africa was claimed for that European power, they would have to demonstrate to the rest of Europe that they could control it. Because if they couldn't control it, then another European power could take it over. All right, so let's kind of use some common sense. If you are a strong European nation, which all of these are strong European powers that are meeting in, you got the British, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, they're all meeting here. How can they exert a tremendous amount of control over an area of Africa? Huh?
Slaves.
Okay, but how are you gonna make sure that happens?
Make them work for them.
But how are you gonna make them work for you?
Punish them.
How are you gonna punish them? Huh?
Fine.
You're gonna use your power. You're gonna use military might. You're gonna use extreme influence and be as harsh as possible to basically make these people do everything that you want them to do. You're gonna make them live in fear. Okay? And isn't that what Leopold did? That's exactly what he did. Interestingly enough, guess who's not invited to the conference to divide Africa? Nope. Huh? Nope. England's there. No, Germany was there. Berlin's in Germany. What are they doing? What's the purpose? To divide Africa? Nobody from Africa is there. Nobody's invited. None of these tribes, none of that. Europe is dividing Africa, and they don't care. Might makes right. This is actually from a French newspaper. It just kind of shows them, cutting up the pie or the cake, right? Dividing it amongst themselves. They quickly discovered that there's different types of raw materials that exist in Africa that you can't find in Europe. Like rubber, oil. You can find copper and tin and gold in certain places of the world, but there was a lot of it in Africa. And so with these raw materials and the demand for those raw materials, all it did was entice European powers to even go further in and go to great lengths to do whatever was necessary, to the point that they just start pushing people off their land. They don't even care. Remember we talked about they were supposed to divide everything up? Didn't matter. Push everybody off their land. We got plantations that are developed in addition to all this other stuff. So Africa is, you think about it. Okay, so I want you to kind of picture Africa in your mind, right? Think about like the northern part of Africa. When I say countries like Egypt or Libya or Morocco, what kind of comes to your mind? Sand, desert, right? Okay. All right, then you go a little further south, you've got the Sahara. What's the Sahara? Yes, the largest desert in the world, right? Okay. Then go further to the east, and you've got Somalia. It's still kind of deserty. But then you go further south, and you get to Kenya. What do you know about Kenya? You've got grasslands, right? Okay, you got Mount Kilimanjaro. You've got, you think of the giraffes and all those kinds of things that live in Kenya, and even further south than that. And then you've got in the kind of the south central part is the Congo. And the Congo is almost not necessarily a rainforest type climate, but it's a wetter climate. Then you get to the very south part of Africa, being what? South Africa. Anybody know anything about South Africa? Yeah. So how would the book describe South Africa?
It was set on a boat that passed over heights and stuff, and there was a lot of terrain and a lot of wild animals.
Yes, so you've got in the northern part of South Africa, it is very mountainous. What about kind of the bottom part of South Africa? There's a coast.
I would
Very
say it's
good.
probably more flat, and so I know there's cities now, but I'm not really sure.
South Africa, like for instance, we talked about the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Town, South Africa. South Africa is nothing like what you think Africa is. South Africa is like, it's a good way to put it. It's very modernized, but it's almost like a tourist area. They have beautiful beaches. There's a lot of money in South Africa. So when you start looking at it there's a lot of different climates in Africa in and of itself. And so it becomes very intriguing for these European powers to kind of experience all this. This is actually a picture of South Africa. So, I mean, that's not Egypt, by the way. So you think of what, Egypt and pyramids. No, it's totally different. There's going to be two countries that start pushing toward South Africa, settling South Africa. But the problem is there's also an indigenous group that's in the southeastern part of Africa that they're going to be dealing with. So the two countries, European nations, are these. Anybody know? Well, we obviously know what the bottom right is. What's that? The bottom right. England. What about the top left? Nope. Nope. Nope.
They all use the same colors.
They do, yeah. Huh? Holland. The Dutch. Okay, good. The Dutch. If you said it, I didn't hear you. Say it louder. So yeah, the Dutch. Yeah, the French flag, the stripes are what? Vertical. Okay. All right, so the Dutch and the English, they're going to push in South Africa, but here's the problem. Remember I told you that indigenous group that's in southeastern Africa? The Zulu. Zulu's a little different. They're very territorial. They do not like people that are not Zulu. And they will fight you quickly if you are not Zulu. All right, we're probably going to have time for one more slide. That'll be it. I'll tell you what, I'm just going to stop here. I'll leave this up here if you want to type it out, but we've got like a minute and a half, 2 minutes left. And then I'll start talking about the borders when we come back on Monday. So don't forget, over the weekend, at some point, make sure you do your next current event. No reading over the weekend.